Hi, it's Heather from Thicketworks. Today's project was inspired by this romantic sketch by Augustus Pugin. While reinterpreting this beautiful piece, every attempt has been made to honor the spirit of the original sketch, while updating the surface details and some of the structural components so that they can be easily created with today's technology, in this case, a Cricut Maker, lightweight chipboard, and cardstock. Certain areas of the surface have been gilded with metal leaf, and others have been treated to a faux walnut finish. The delicate canopy details have been strengthened with the addition of gilded panels that support the delicate motifs. The finished piece stands just over 8 inches tall and is 3 inches wide and deep. It does take a while to cut all of these detailed files, but once you do, you'll have the building blocks to create this striking piece. And here we are. We have the back panel and the side panels, both the base and the top panels, the seat riser and the seat itself, the components for the reading platform, a little frame to dress up the uppermost edge, and all of the molding. The construction process begins by laminating together the 4 panels that make up the back. To simplify the construction process, I've created a very basic right-angled jig file for you to download from the Thicketworks website, and with it you can build this set of right-angled jigs that will help enormously to align your pieces on this and all other Thicketworks projects. I'm experimenting this time with Typebond 3 Ultimate Wood Glue, which they say is waterproof. We'll see how it holds up. I begin by using it for the lamination process, and that's a fancy way of saying sticking all of these layers together using glue. You can see how the jig really comes in handy to assist in the alignment process. Now, there are some things that I really like about the Typebond, and one of them is the fact that it is quite liquid in comparison to mini PVA glues. I suppose that you could get the same effect by watering down Aleene's Tacky Glue, but it also has a quality of drying very quickly, even though it's quite liquid. It's a bit of a paradox, but I did enjoy those qualities while creating this particular project. Now, as usual, the construction process consists of laminating together all of the necessary layers to create each individual component. And in this build, that's made simple by the fact that almost every single component consists of 4 layers. When one of those layers is blank, meaning it has no apertures cut out of it like you see here, then that's going to be one of the exterior panels. Just make certain that you glue it on the outside of your stack of layers. Otherwise, just glue all 4 layers together for each and every component, including the little reading desk platform. So once you've glued all 4 of these layers together, set this piece aside and we'll work on the frame for it. Now the frame also consists of 4 layers, but in this case we're going to be gluing 2 and 2 together. So we'll make one little frame that consists of 2 layers, and then we'll do the same with the other remaining 2 pieces. This way, we'll have a frame component for either side of the little reading platform. And once those have been glued together, we can immediately attach them to the rectangular panel. One of the small frames on either side. Once both sets of frames have been attached to the little reading platform, this component is now 8 layers thick, and for that reason I'm going to rely on a double layer of the right angle jigs. You see, they're 4 layers thick each, and they aren't sufficient in height to help align an 8-layer thick piece, unless, of course, they're doubled. Another exception to the 4-layer rule is this slightly larger frame. It consists of 2 layers and will ultimately be installed on the upper surface of the canopy platform. Next, I'm going to laminate together 4 layers each of all of the molding components. Here we're creating a series of layered moldings, and eventually they'll be 12 layers thick, which is quite substantial. These pieces will be used on either side of the base of the piece and act as a beautiful balance to the canopy above. The Titebond is doing an excellent job of laminating together all of these layers of lightweight chipboard. I really can't complain about it at all as an adhesive for this process. It's easy to apply with a brush, and it cleans up with soap and water. It's relatively low toxicity, almost no smell at all, and in many ways it's a delight to work with Titebond. I'll be using it again, but I do have some reservations about it that we'll talk about a little later. Once all of these molding components have been laminated and have been allowed to cure, neaten up all of the edges using a combination of sandpaper, and if you have a nail drill like I do, that can come in handy for some of the curved areas. Because I'm experimenting with Titebond today, I'm using it to harden the piece. It's relatively non-toxic and dries very quickly. The coated pieces do not have the substantial and wood-like feel that comes from the hardening process when using superglue, but they're perfectly acceptable. Next, it's time to work on the decorative cardstock components. These 4 layers of cardstock cover the back of the piece. This panel is for the interior back. These 2 panels serve as top and bottom for the canopy. These blank exterior panels hide all of the construction tabs, a decorative frame for beneath the seat, and 2 exterior frames. Finally, we have the decorative borders that make up the layered edge of the canopy. The borders are pre-cut to the lengths needed to cover the sides and the front and the back of the canopy framework. Now, all of these decorative items consist of 4 layers each, except for the blank side pieces. And by that, I mean these guys, which consist of just 2 layers of cardstock each, 1 to finish off the exterior on either side. The layers of cardstock are glued together just as all of the underlying construction components were. I found it quite easy to use a flat bristle brush to apply the liquid glue across all the surfaces of these delicate components. It worked really well, and if you caught that, there was one point at which I actually peeled a layer back and was able to reposition it. That's unusual. Most adhesives wouldn't allow me that much working time, so I did enjoy that aspect of working with the Titebond wood glue. Really, my only reservation about the Titebond is that it doesn't result in quite as sturdy and wood-like a finished product as it does when you're working with superglue as your hardening agent. But other than that, and the fact that it does not play terribly well with stains, you'll see that in an upcoming segment here. I'm sure it would be fine if you were going to finish your piece with, say, acrylic paints. Before I attempt to add much staining to this piece, I'd like to begin by creating wood-like texture, and for that, I'm turning to the simplest of tools, a ball stylus that has a very fine and a medium fine point, and I'm alternating between those 2 sizes of stylus in order to create a variegated wood grain effect. It's not terribly refined, but it certainly does give the impression of grain. It's difficult to see here. It'll be a little easier once we add some pigment to this surface. Because the reading platform is detachable and may get handled more than the rest of the piece, I am going to take the precaution of additionally hardening this surface with thin superglue. Now, as I apply the superglue to this already sealed surface, you'll notice that on one of the sides where I obviously was not terribly careful in my application of wood glue, the superglue soaks in and leaves what amounts to a large stain in the center of the piece. It also does not dry very quickly on this already sealed surface, so I'm using some accelerator to help with that process. Since this is the project for experimenting, I'm going to experiment this time using Distress ink to tint the surface of the piece. Distress ink is water-based and typically quite easy to work with, especially when using one of these foam applicators. And I love the walnut stain. It's a rich, dark brown. And in the areas where it bonds with the surface, it leaves an incredibly dark wood tone. However, I was a bit disappointed in just how patchy the application of the wood tone is. Luckily, I prefer distressed looking surfaces, but if you don't, paint rather than ink would be a good choice. Next comes one of my favorite processes. I can't say I'm really good at it, but I enjoy it very much. I begin the process, which is a little messy, by donning some gloves that help me avoid a sticky outcome on my fingertips. And then I stir up the Mona Lisa size, and using a smallish flat brush, apply the size to all of the areas that I want the metal leaf to adhere to. And then once I've done that, it's time to set the pieces aside and allow them to cure. This doesn't take too long. With this particular size, it's about half an hour. And that gives me time to work on staining some of the other components that are not going to be gilded with metal leaf. And again, I'm using the walnut stain, which is a distress product and is water-based. And you'll see here some of the really patchy effects that I got because of the wood glue. Okay, these pieces have cured long enough, and now it's time for me to begin the process of mangling this beautiful metal leaf as I attempt to gently float it onto the sticky surfaces. That's actually better than I usually do, and I'm very proud of myself for that one. A big, soft, flat brush is helpful to press the leaf down onto the surface of your piece. Then you can just burnish it down with your fingertips if you choose, and then begin removing all of the excess leaf. It's a messy process, I admit it, but it's worth it in the end. I mean, look at that metallic shine. There's just no paint in the world that gives you that kind of rich finish. I just love the way it looks. And in juxtaposition with the darkness of the walnut stain, I think it's really effective and it evokes that old world feeling. I really love the way that gilded surface shines through behind the decorative overlay. Now this is the back of the piece, and once the overlay panel is installed, it's going to be gorgeous. Yep, I really like that. Now on the interior, we have a shorter panel that will perform much the same function. And then for the top and the bottom of the canopy itself, we have the same pattern. Now I've gilded one of these little frame edges, and I'm going to continue that with the other. And this frame has been gilded, and it will top off the upper surface of the canopy panel. Ugh, that size is so sticky. I've stained these overlay panels, and they'll provide a nice contrast to these little gilded quatrefoil frames. The upper edges of the molding pieces have also been gilded. I just want there to be a touch of antique gold showing through at the base. I really do enjoy the contrast between the rich gold and the darkness of the walnut stain. I'm now going to seal all of these gilded pieces with shellac. Mostly because I really can't stand the stickiness, and it takes about 48 hours for that to dissipate. So shellacking it right now is going to make my life more pleasant. I apply the shellac with a disposable cosmetic sponge. It works perfectly well for this application. I'll be using tacky glue to put the piece together, and I'm going to begin by layering up these trim pieces. Tacky glue gives me enough working time that I can gently move the pieces around until they're as close to perfectly aligned as I can get them. Pushing them against the machined edge of a 1-2-3 block is really helpful, and it also helps me to verify at the end of the process that they are going to be seating correctly. Once I'm satisfied that the first set of moldings is relatively aligned, I repeat the process with the other set, and then just put them underneath some weight and allow them to cure. And now construction proper begins, and I'm excited. I love this phase of the project. A modest bead of tacky glue is applied to each of the construction tabs. Here you see one of the side panels and the back panel. And then they are carefully fitted together. And this is one of the reasons I love tacky glue, is that it can be convinced to hold relatively quickly. It doesn't take that long for the bond to begin, and it's good enough that I can release this piece and move on to the next phase in relatively short order. I really like that. After scraping away the excess adhesive, I am now taking the platform that serves as the seat and installing it into the side and the back panel. There's a series of slots on the underside of this seat, so make sure when you're installing it that those construction slots face downward. This little arched riser holds this seat in place. And now it's time to apply the other side panel. I'll let that set up for a while. After about half an hour, I'm ready to continue, and it's time to install the bottom panel. The slots in the bottom panel line up with the tabs on the bottom of the seat riser, and then everything snaps into place against both the side and back panels. A very similar process is used to install the panel that holds the canopy in place. At this point, the piece is strong enough to place some heavy weights on top and allow it to cure. I've chosen to attempt to add wood texture to these outer overlay panels for each of the sides of the piece. And again, I'm using a ball stylus, and the reason that I chose a ball stylus instead of, say, scraping with the tip of a craft knife or a wire brush is because it won't tend to create that typical fuzzy texture that a sharper tool will. Instead, it's going to leave rounded trenches in the surface. And I really actually like the way this turned out. It's a bit heavy-handed looking and maybe a tad out of scale, but I like it. The carcass has had an opportunity to cure, and now I get to install some of these beautiful overlays over all that luscious metallic gilding. I'm going to begin with dry fitting them just to make sure that everything is going according to plan. And it looks good, so it's time to permanently install the decorative overlays. Since building this prototype, the design for the back panel has been enlarged so that it extends fully from top to bottom. The awkward gap that you see here at the top is something that I thought might be necessary in order to accommodate the trim surrounding the canopy, but it was counterproductive, so that has been corrected. Now it's time to add the filigree framework beneath this seat. And the decorative panel that covers the interior of the back of the unit. Decorative panels on both the interior and exterior of the canopy. And the canopy panel gets topped off with this gilded frame, and this hides all of the construction tabs and slots. At this stage, it's time to add the plain overlays on either side of the unit. These chunky molding panels get installed, one on either side of the base. And clamps are applied to the moldings just to make sure that they don't shift out of position during the curing process. Now the two layers of the decorative borders are glued together prior to installing them around the edge of the canopy. Now that the base moldings have cured, we can install these little filigree frames that rest above them, one on either side of the exterior of the piece. I do my best to center it on that panel. And then repeat the operation on the other side. Although I haven't yet found a metallic paint that matches the luster of actual metal leaf, This gold tinted chrome marker does a relatively good job, especially if it's playing a minor role. Here I'm using it to tint very thin strips of cardstock that I've decided to apply along the exterior edge of the back of the panel. It's not necessary, I just thought it would give a nice finishing touch. And now it's finally time to install that decorative trim. I just love the way it has turned out, and it gives the piece an amazing stability. In fact, I dropped this and it tumbled down an entire flight of stairs, and it suffered no damage. I was really shocked, but it is sturdy as can be and should hold up to all kinds of handling over many, many years. So although I can't really compare the finish that we get using the wood glue to that is obtained when you harden the piece with super glue, I can attest to the fact that it results in a very sturdy miniature. It's quite gratifying to see this piece finally come together. I added just a few more touches with strips of cardstock. And again, the chrome marker does a decent job at simulating a metallic surface. It would have been preferable for me had I actually gilded these strips, but I think the result is definitely within acceptable parameters. Let's see, what else? You know, I really like how that golden strip dresses up the canopy. I think I'll add a few more of these. One across the front of the seat and one across the front of the bottom. That just really brings it all together. And now I'm going to install the reading platform. I love that. I want one of these that's full-sized. Now, it wouldn't be a proper reading bench if we didn't have some reading materials. So I've prepared a wide array of printables to accompany this project. There are 6 miniature book covers, marbled end papers, lots and lots of double-sided book pages, illuminated manuscript pages, and scrolls. The print then cut process for all of these little treasures is covered in the detailed instructions that are included with this SVG bundle. When the printables have been scored and cut on the Cricut Maker, we're left with a series of components that come together beautifully to create a series of miniature books with marbled end papers, detailed covers, and lots of double-sided pages. These were printed on newsprint, and they're extremely thin and pliable. I really like this weight of paper. It's perfect for miniature book pages. However, they also are amazing when printed on regular copy paper. Now we'll go through the miniature book creation process step by step. Included in the SVG bundle are 2 sizes of book board covers. Now it's difficult to see here, but they have been scored down the back to delineate the spine of each of the books. And then the covers themselves are also scored precisely to help you construct everything with a minimum of difficulty. The end papers are also scored down the center. To reinforce the scores, I recommend using the side of a rigid but thin palette knife like this one against a soft surface like some fun foam. Reinforce the existing crease and be gentle with the chipboard during this process. We want to gently convince it into shape rather than trying to quickly force it. At this point, I'm going to reinforce these score lines using an agate burnisher. Now, a bone folder will do just as well. Just be gentle and move a little bit slowly. There. Now we have a good basis for the book cover. And here's one of the printed covers. And again, I'm going to reinforce existing score lines with the edge of this palette knife blade. Now, because the scoring takes place on the printed side, we're going to need to reverse all of these little creases. But that's very easily done. Once you've reinforced them in one direction, it's very simple to flip the piece over and reverse the direction of the folds. You can see why I like the agate burnisher. It's got an extremely fine tip and it's perfect for tiny projects like this. Now I'm testing my text block to see if it is thick enough to fit within the confines of my proposed book cover. By adding and subtracting several pages, I can get just the right depth. And then I do my best to line these pages up and I clamp them in place. A thick layer of tacky glue is then tapped into the spine area of the text block. This forces a little bit of the adhesive down between the pages and also leaves a nice thick residue on the upper edge. That process is repeated 3 times for every text block. Now I'm working on one of the thicker books. The process is exactly the same. I line up the pages, add tacky glue, and gently tap it into the spine area. Allow that to cure and do it 2 more times. The next time that I make these little books, I'm going to be a little less ambitious with the thickness of my text blocks. I sized these to fit perfectly, and they are a little too thick in the long run. So I would recommend that you err on the side of making your text block slightly skinnier than necessary, and that will help your books to close naturally. These little sewing clips are the perfect size to hold the smaller size of text block as you apply the glue. This time I'm going to use a slightly larger ball stylus to help round out the spines of these little book covers. And I'll repeat this process for all 6 of the included books. Now, because the print then cut process results in glaring white edges which drive me crazy, I'm going to apply a little bit of distress ink by picking up a diluted amount on the end of the bristles of a plain water brush. If those glaring white edges bother you as much as they bother me, then you'll find the process of getting rid of them contemplative and peaceful, as I did. It takes a while to go around all of those edges, but to me, it's worth it to have an end result that I feel good about. There. Now we finally get to construct the books. I'm using a needle-tipped applicator here to dispense a small amount of PVA onto either side of the book cover. I'm not applying any in the spine area. I want that to be free to move a little bit. But I am adding some to the flaps, which are then getting folded over onto the chipboard. Now, because they are so small, it does take some convincing to get them to finally stay in place. The water brush comes in handy again to help me apply the adhesive and spread it around these tiny little flaps. And as always, my little agate burnisher is my best friend when it comes to tiny fussy little jobs like this one. Now, while the piece is still freshly covered with adhesive, I'm very slowly and gently reinforcing the creases on either side of the spine. I printed all of my book covers using a laser printer, which makes the prints a little more durable than those created on an inkjet, but creasing the print still results in the little white lines that you see on either side of the spine. I'll disguise those with a bit more of the distress ink at a later stage. Now I'm applying the end papers, and they are pre-folded so that they fit perfectly along the edge of each of the book boards and leave the area of the spine free. I'm just rounding the spine a little bit using gentle pressure with my fingertips. That's so cute. I continue with this process, adding the printed book covers and the end papers to each of the chipboard book boards, and then allowing those to cure after clamping them with the little sewing clips. Next, it's time to work with the text box. So after all 3 layers of PVA glue have dried and the spines are secure, each block gets unclamped. The next stage is to glue the text blocks between the end papers. Now, I neglected to do something important during this stage. I'm applying glue to the interior of each of the end papers, and I'm just smoothing it out a little bit with a fingertip. Now, here's where I made my error. I should have placed a tiny slip of waxed paper between the folded end papers. And the reason that I recommend doing that is because if you don't, you'll risk gluing your text block and your end papers together into one big clump, and that's not what you want. I was able to fairly easily cut them apart using a scalpel, but who wants to waste time doing that when it's not necessary? So make it easy on yourself and use a little bit of waxed paper, and you won't have to cut your pages apart. Now, once the text blocks are in place, it's important to clamp them and to leave them until the books are fully cured. I left mine overnight. The next day, these little books are fully operational, and I apologize, but I did add a little bit of the metallic chrome marker to the edges of these pages off camera, just to experiment to see how it would work. My favorite thing about these books is how delicate the printing is, and the fact that each of the pages is in fact double-sided. For me, that just makes it all come together. Now, here's one of the pieces intended to be a scroll, and like most of the others, I'm going to distress it a little bit with some distress ink. This time I'm using Vintage Photo, which is a warm brown that's not terribly dark or intense, but it gives things a warm, mellow vintage feel. These tiny illuminated manuscript pages just delight me. So after adding Vintage Photo around the edges of most of these pieces, I put the ink away and bring out an aluminum knitting needle. Now, any cylindrical object will work, so grab a pencil or a skewer or whatever you have lying around. It'll work just fine. Now, I was having fun using the knitting needle to create the little curlicues in the end of my scroll, but I discovered after lots of finagling that I wasn't really satisfied with the amount of curlicue that I was getting. I mean, it was pretty good, but it's not good enough. So after frustrating myself for a few minutes, I realized all I really needed was something skinnier. So I traded in my big fat knitting needle for one of a more slender variety, and immediately I was in love with the results. Now this is much more like it. That's the kind of scroll I had in mind. To complete this little vignette, I spend a few moments distressing and wrinkling and playing with the loose manuscript pages. A large part of the pleasure that I derive personally from designing and creating miniatures is the imaginative journey that each one takes me on. And in this case, I'm imagining the life of a medieval scribe dedicated to his craft, but perhaps making a few errors now and then that end up in crumpled heaps on the floor surrounding his splendid Gothic reading bench. Thank you, Augustus Pugin, for being the force of nature that you were. Without your tireless dedication to reviving our appreciation of Gothic design, the world would be a much poorer place. I like to think that this little canopied Gothic reading bench is helping to contribute to a miniature Gothic revival in our own time. It's been a wonderful journey creating this piece and immersing myself in the imaginative realm of our ancestors for just a few short hours. I hope that if you choose to create this piece, that you find half as much enjoyment in the process as I did. As always, thank you for hanging out with me today. And until next time, bye.